I tell you what, it's not like the olden days. I'm Jake.
I'm Rosie.
And this is our podcast on Poirot. I've mentioned David Suchet's striking and wonderful transformation into Poirot on these podcasts before. It really is a brilliant piece of immersive acting, which he achieves through his acting skills, but which is also achieved through physically transforming him with hair, makeup, moustache, bodysuit. I remember seeing him in something else for the first time, having been watching Poirot for more than 10 years, and thinking, goodness me, is that really David Suchet? He's completely different from Poirot. And he is completely different from Poirot quite deliberately. He did a lot of research to bring the character to life using all the input from Agatha Christie that he could find. Agatha Christie wrote many Poirot stories over many years, and David Suchet dedicatedly tried to bring this character to life using every description of him, his manner, his voice, his walk that Agatha Christie had ever come up with. And perhaps, like with the Superman comics, she often didn't have all these aspects to the character in her mind at once when writing about him. But that's what David Suchet put together for us and played on ITV for practically 25 years. He was putting on his Poirot get-up and getting into the Poirot character in his mind and his voice and his manner, really for 25 years exactly, filming it from the summer of 1988 to the summer of 2013. The series first aired in January 1989 and last aired in November 2013, so they could bring out the big box set of all 70 episodes at the beginning of 2014, which is when I bought it and got reacquainted with some of the early ones, having not seen them for a very long time or at all. It was something I used to stay up and watch when I used to refuse to go to bed. I didn't like going to bed at all. The other programme I really associate with that sort of situation is Bergerac. But I did find Poirot particularly stimulating, the character of Poirot himself, also his supporting cast, particularly Captain Hastings. I'll come on to some more details in a moment about them. If you listen to David Suchet in an interview talking about how he did all this research and put in all this effort to bring Poirot to life, he'll also tell you that he wanted to make sure that Poirot was never a figure of fun with all his fussy, pernickety ways. David always says them with a twinkle and a laugh and gives Poirot very much a sense of humour, and indeed in a lot of the writing of the show, Poirot could come across as a figure of fun. We were watching the first episode, the pilot episode, The Adventure of the Clapham Cook, the other day, and one thing you said, which was quite striking, is that Poirot was very overwritten there, worrying about pomading his moustache and so on. So David Suchet made very sure to say certain things with a twinkle in his eye and be making a little joke to Hastings as he leaves the flat, in order to make Poirot a friendly character. He has his little ways, his little foibles, these distinctions that make him such a unique character, but he's also a character we're going to like. He cares about people, he has good friends whom he values and has a joke with when appropriate, and David Suchet does a marvellous job, I think, of balancing these aspects of Poirot to create a truly wonderful character, a wonderful television depiction and interpretation of the character. Whenever I've seen bits of Peter Ustinov playing Poirot in those movies in like the 70s and 80s, I always say, oh, he's just putting on a French accent and saying the lines. However, of course, Poirot isn't French, he's Belgian. French is, of course, his native language, and people always mistake him for being French, and that's a kind of running gag. No, madame, I am Belgian. But his casual acquaintances don't ever seem to remember. But of course, as you then point out to me, Peter Ustinov really can't be expected to get into the role so submersively. He's not going to be playing it for 25 years on primetime ITV entertainment. He's just been asked to knock out these movies, and he's doing what needs to be done. So I think we really do have David Suchet to thank for making Poirot a memorable character in the soup, in the national consciousness. A very important aspect of the early episodes of Poirot is his three main supporting characters. Captain Hastings, played by Hugh Fraser, Chief Inspector Japp, played by Philip Jackson, and Miss Lemon, who is Poirot's secretary, and she was played by Pauline Moran. As I mentioned, when I was very young, I did used to enjoy Hugh Fraser as Captain Hastings. I used to enjoy his interactions with Poirot, and they are kind of a chalk and cheese duo. And they do have this very strong, very sort of pure platonic love relationship where they balance each other out very nicely. I do find them very appealing on the screen. I used to like Poirot saying Hastings in his way, and Hastings replying with, "I say, Poirot, good Lord, Poirot," and so on. And I did used to enjoy Hugh Fraser's representation of that kind of upper class, not exactly twit, but Englishman who perhaps sometimes has his head a little too much in the clouds and isn't the quickest on the uptake. But Hastings certainly has his moments in the show. I didn't find Miss Lemon or Chief Inspector Japp quite so striking or memorable when I was little. I do appreciate them a lot more now. But I was very interested when you told me your feelings about Hastings and Japp, particularly in relation to each other.
I prefer Japp because I find that he feels more real. Hastings is quite a lot of a caricature. His posh accent seems rather exaggerated, and I suppose you could say that Japp's sort of police accent is rather exaggerated. But the way he delivers his lines sounds more natural, and in that pilot episode they try to set up this professional rivalry. Inspector Japp can never know I'm doing unimportant missing cook finding, and Japp's kind of finding out and laughing at him, but they really don't keep that up. Not only is it too much effort to keep overwriting the characters in that way, but the actors really allow them not to do that and just focus on the mystery and interact in their own way, which becomes much more natural and friendly than they set out to do.
They obviously took a lot of time and effort setting out this whole idea for Agatha Christie's Poirot on paper, and we've come up with a couple of examples there of things that didn't really come into being in practice. The way the actors interpret those things and change them and craft the show really makes the whole thing work out much better than those ideas on paper. And isn't that always the case with these successful things? The actors bring something special and interpret the material in their own way, and thus you get a long-lasting hit. Whenever someone does try to write this professional rivalry between Poirot and Japp, it doesn't really work because of the warmth and camaraderie they both bring to their characters and the way they interact together and work together. Japp, of course, will often be reduced in the story to the role of the bumbling policeman. When Chief Inspector Japp has arrested somebody halfway through the show, you know that that person isn't going to be the murderer, and Poirot is halfway to proving that already. But the way they always join together as a team, also with Hastings and Miss Lemon sometimes, the four of them are in many ways an awesome foursome, works really, really well, and that's where you see the characters at their best, all working together and getting along together, backing up Poirot in the investigation.
Japp and Hastings are rather like the audience in some ways, if the audience is not very experienced at watching or reading Agatha Christie and taking things at face value and making assumptions. Rather like Dr. Watson in that respect, and that's what's interesting about Hastings to me. He's actually the narrator of most of the Poirot books. I think there are some exceptions, and he is Poirot's Dr. Watson, and there are some parallels, at least one other than being the narrator, is that he gets married partway through the series, like Watson did.
Does Watson believe his wife to be guilty of murder or something during the story and then marry her afterwards? That's what happens to Hastings.
I can't remember exactly, but she's certainly involved in the case.
I was thinking somewhere in my mind about Holmes and Watson when I was talking about Poirot and Hastings just now with their pure, simple, strong, platonic love. It's not very clear whether Hastings actually shares Poirot's flat. I think sometimes whoever's writing the episode thinks he does, and sometimes not. But I think Agatha Christie would have really admitted that there's got to be some influence from Holmes and Watson in there. It's true that Chief Inspector Japp is a police caricature in many ways.
Like the police inspector in The Sign of Four, which is that Holmes novel where Watson meets his wife.
But I can see what you mean about Philip Jackson doing a better job than Hugh Fraser at making that kind of caricature-ish aspect of the character more real. It's a bit like we were saying on the Thundercats podcast about how you thought Earl Hyman, the voice of Panthro, was much better than the rest of the Thundercats cast at bringing those kind of presenting a character lines to life. Yes, if ever Hastings picks up a clue and says, "I say, Poirot, here's a piece of silk. Must have been dropped by the murderer," you know that that's not going to be what happened at all. And when Japs found out that somebody has a motive for the murder, must have bumped her off to get his hands on her money, that sort of thing, that's probably not going to be true either. And Poirot has this enigmatic way of saying perhaps whenever Hastings or Jap or anyone else puts forward a theory like that to him. And that sums up Poirot's method rather nicely, and that's another thing that's particularly special about him. He's like Jonathan Creek in many ways. He pieces together the truth by getting to grips with the logistics of what's actually happened. It's a bit like a magic trick. Poirot doesn't assume or try to make evidence fit arbitrary theories. He observes, he listens, he digests, he considers people, their psychology. He's very keen on psychology. He considers the logistics of the situation. Like Sherlock Holmes, he considers what is possible, not just what is likely. And as Poirot says, that's where the police fall down. They're looking for a nice, quick, likely explanation to be able to finish off their case files and convict someone and move on. And of course, Poirot is a former police officer from Brussels, and you can see in a flashback episode called The Chocolate Box, which isn't one of the best episodes, how his methods and his mentality of actually wanting to solve a crime don't really match with the attitude of the police in Brussels and get him into trouble with his superiors. So yes, I think it's true to say the police are presented in a certain way in Poirot, and in contrast to Poirot himself, and even Japp, who is, as Poirot says in an early episode, a good policeman, can't possibly hope to live up to the crime-solving skills of Poirot. But I've always very much enjoyed the way he pieces together the truth like Jonathan Creek does. People give him their testimony. He takes nothing at face value. He considers what people have told him. He looks at the physical evidence. He spots inconsistencies, things that don't quite match up in the case, and pieces together the truth from there. And I think perhaps the best episode that shows that is the one called Five Little Pigs, where he's piecing together a cold case, a murder from about 10 years ago, by interviewing the 5 people involved, and from what they tell him, he pieces together the truth. And this is what he always does, really, except usually there's some bits of physical evidence for us to consider, so we can perhaps work it out as we go through the episode. And as we were watching Poirot during the 21st century, we did get rather good at spotting things that Agatha Christie likes to have as part of her solution. Even if we didn't get the exact answer, we spotted the important aspects, the building blocks of her solution. She's very keen on disguise. Often characters are dressed up, made up as other characters who we, the audience, or characters in the story may or may not have met so far, in order to achieve the crime. Kind of a variation on that is imposters. If someone claims they're so-and-so's father or niece who's been away on the continent for several years, there's a very good chance that they're not. Some of her motives do get used over and over again. In the first appearance of Zoe Wanamaker as Ariadne Oliver, who is a self-insert from Agatha Christie. She's in some of the later Poirot stories to provide a voice for Agatha Christie. She's a caricature of Christie herself. I do find Zoe Wanamaker's performance as Ariadne Oliver, as frustrated Agatha Christie, been writing Poirot for so long she's grown to rather resent him, very amusing. And in this first one she's in, which is called Cards on the Table, Honeysuckle Weeks asks her, do you have any idea what the motive could have been for this murder, Mrs. Oliver? And then she reels off all these Agatha Christie standard motives. Oh yes, I've got lots of ideas what the motive could have been. Maybe by killing Mr. Shaitana, the murderer has put himself in line for a huge inheritance. Or maybe the murderer was a bigamist and Shaitana knew it, so he had to be put out of the way. But of course it's all just theory, and as we the audience know, that's a terribly funny joke because it's exactly the sorts of things that keep happening as motives in the actual show. Ariadne Oliver comes out with things like, you come up with an idea, people seem to like it, and the next thing you know, you're tied to this awful character for life and you don't know what to write about him next. She has her own fictional detective. He's Finnish, even though she knows absolutely nothing about Finland. His name's Sven Hurston. And Ariadne Oliver's frustrations about him are an exact mirror of Agatha Christie's frustrations about Poirot, and I do enjoy that gentle humour of inserting that into the stories. Ariadne Oliver even says to Poirot at one point, oh, you really are the most infuriating man, when he's trying to get her to organise her thoughts. And clearly that's how Christie feels as she's writing her novels. Is Poirot going to be satisfied with what I've written? Sometimes it takes some doing.
Some of her hallmarks give you a surefire way of spotting the murderer if you know them. Discovering the body is quite a good one. Anyone saying, oh my goodness, look, my cousin, my wife, my friend has been killed. Probably they've just killed them themselves, or even quite a few hours earlier.
Or they haven't killed them yet, but they've made it look like they're dead with some fake blood or something and are about to kill them while everyone's rushing about.
The other one is attempted murders. Usually a person will poison themselves to try and divert suspicion. There's one called Peril at End House, in which Mademoiselle Nick befriends Poirot and starts by saying, oh, a bee's just flown in my face, and Poirot spots a bullet in the net bit of her hat that keeps the flies off. And it's not very far into the series, but I said, having not seen the series for a very, very long time and forgotten everything, oh, she put that there herself.
It's actually the premiere of Series 2, that episode. It's the first feature-length story.
She does a thing I find irritating, which is to involve Poirot deliberately and try and get him to be an impartial witness and believe that someone's tried to shoot her in the face and all the other duplicitous things she's tried to do. But of course, involving Poirot is the one surefire way of having someone work out what you're up to.
I've liked Peril at End House less and less the more I've watched it on DVD, but it does contain a good example of Poirot piecing together the truth from something that just doesn't quite ring true, which is where Mademoiselle Nick has these letters, which are actually written to her cousin, who has the same Christian name as she does, and Poirot works out that this man who was supposedly in love with, wanted to marry Mademoiselle Nick, has written to her on this date, and yet she's just had her appendix out a few days before, and he does not mention it. And to Poirot that just has not rung true, that he hasn't said, oh, how was the op? I hope you're feeling better. And from there, Poirot works out the whole truth of Mademoiselle Nick trying to get the money of the father of the man who wanted to marry her cousin with this very elaborate plan, which, as you say, involves getting Poirot in as an impartial witness. And that is, indeed, a very silly thing to do. We often used to say when watching Poirot, if you've got this plan to murder someone and you realise, Poirot is on the plane, Poirot is on the train, Poirot is staying at the hotel, Poirot is here on the cruise, you really should not do it and look for a better opportunity, because however clever you think you are, Poirot is going to unravel it all. The next stage after that is to actually call Poirot in and try to make him part of your clever plan. And that happens quite a few times. For example, in the one with the pies, which involves calling in Poirot and sitting there in disguise in order to set things in motion before you shoot your employer. There's the one where a superintendent of police wants to kill his estranged evil father. And the very first thing he does is tell his estranged evil father to invite Poirot for Christmas. I mean, if you want to kill your estranged evil father over the Christmas period, the very first thing you should do is ascertain that Poirot is spending Christmas at home in Whitehaven Mansions. Poirot often appeared on the telly rather sporadically. For those first few years, LWT did actually make it quite dedicatedly in regular series of 10 episodes, mainly adapting the short stories into 50-minute episodes. And some of them are so short that they barely come in at 50 minutes, and Poirot has to spend 5 minutes showing the characters how to cut up a mango. That's another Christmas episode there, where he's gone to stay with someone for Christmas and there's going to be a crime, although not actually a murder in that case. He just gets a little girl to pretend she's been murdered to flush out the culprit.
I was hoping that the mango would provide some sort of metaphor for later on. There's a jewel in the Christmas pudding, isn't there? They could have perhaps done something with that, but the mango was never mentioned again.
And you only get longer episodes there on special occasions, the beginning of a new series, really. As I mentioned, Peril at End House is the first feature-length one. That's the first episode of Series 2. Series 3 begins with the mysterious affair at Styles, which actually, chronologically, is the first story. It's a flashback to the First World War, to 1917. And it details Poirot and Hastings' first case together. You were disappointed watching that when they revealed, oh, they have actually met before in Belgium. You wanted to see them meeting for the first time.
I did, and Hastings says Poirot was solving a crime of some sort and I was a suspect. And I thought, well, I'd like to see that. What's the point of having a flashback to your first case if you've met each other and already done something more interesting?
And of course, Poirot already knows Inspector James Japp of Scotland Yard in that story. They've worked together as policemen when Poirot was part of the Brussels police force. So you never see him meet any of his friends for the first time. I suppose you do at least see Hastings and Japp meet for the first time in the mysterious affair at Styles. And just to prove that we're 18 years earlier, it's Lieutenant Hastings and Inspector Japp, of course. That reminds me of the timeline. I was disappointed to realise when I got the DVD, it kind of has a floating timeline, but like Heartbeat, it kind of has to for what they want to do. They start the series in 1935, and they don't want to get to the outbreak of the Second World War. If you want to be generous to the show, you can say, oh, well, it's all set between 1935 and 1939, even though Poirot ages 25 years during the course of the show. Like on Heartbeat, Oscar Blaketon and Alf Ventris have obviously aged a great deal more than 5 years between Series 1 and Series 18. But that doesn't actually wash, because you've got things like, in the final episode, Curtain, Poirot's last case, it's set in 1949. Hastings has this daughter who's in her 20s, so if the timeline was going to work exactly, he can't have met her mother on a murder case in 1937, 12 years before. So I find it best not to think about the years in which it's supposed to be set while watching it. I always remembered that Poirot tries to retire at one point in the mid-90s, retire to the village of Kings Markham to grow the vegetable marrows. And of course, what's the first thing that happens when he goes down to Kings Markham? A murdering spree that Poirot then has to solve. But in the next episode, he's moving back into his flat in Whitehaven Mansions, getting Miss Lemon reinstalled, and accepting that, yes, I'd better get on with being a private detective. Of course, that reminds me, one thing we used to point out when watching Poirot in the 21st century was how it was quite rare for someone to actually hire him to look into a case. Normally, he's on holiday somewhere. He happens to be in the restaurant somewhere, and crimes are happening, and he then goes on to solve them.
That sort of format always reminds me of Scooby-Doo. It always just happened to be there.
Things like Doctor Who always has to use that way of getting into things, and sometimes it's inevitable. Like David Banner's nomadic lifestyle in The Incredible Hulk has to lead on to situations where he's going to turn into the Hulk. Otherwise, we're going to change the channel, aren't we? So when I first got the DVD set at the beginning of 2014, I was quite looking forward to seeing people coming to hire Poirot. But what's the first one where he just happens to be in the restaurant and the crime happens? It's the 4th episode, I think, 4 and 20 Blackbirds. And episode 3 isn't the last time that someone comes to hire him, and indeed it does happen occasionally right through to the end, but usually he's just there accidentally getting involved. I'm sure we said about Jonathan Creek, Poirot's spiritual counterpart in another time and another place. It's disappointingly quick that he or Maddie isn't brought in to solve the case, but they're there coincidentally while it's happening. First happens in the Roy Pilgrim one, as I call it, which is the penultimate episode of the first series of Jonathan Creek. So yes, I do always appreciate seeing Poirot being hired to actually come and investigate something, which is another good thing about Five Little Pigs. He can't just stumble into that one. As I said, it is a cold case. So yes, the first three series have those special feature-length ones to get us back into the show, get us in the mood, but they're mainly 50-minute episodes of the short stories, most of them featuring Hastings, Japp and Miss Lemon, with a few absences. Series 4 is quite interesting because it consists of 3 feature-length specials. A very memorable one, the ABC Murders, which is a good example of someone getting Poirot involved deliberately, and he's got a very good plan to get his brother's money, taking advantage of the fact that his brother has the initial CC and lives in a place beginning with C, but needing a private address to make it work and to set up his scapegoat, the poor old shell-shocked war veteran. Using Poirot's address for that is just asking for trouble, isn't it? And of course, the murderer doesn't get away with it in the end.
Having watched that episode again after a while, it was one of the few where I remembered the solution, more or less. I remembered that the real murder was the C. That was the letter that went awry, so it would definitely arrive too late to stop it, and it was the only place that Hastings had to look up in the atlas, because it was an obscure village rather than
Andover, Bexhill and Doncaster, which are 3 quite large towns that people have heard of.
And I couldn't remember the motive or anything, but when Poirot went to the one person who knew anything about the C victim, I said, oh, it's him.
We've also got, in that 4th series, Death in the Clouds and 1-2 Buckle My Shoe. Miss Lemon isn't in any of those, which is a bit of an omission. I always found Death in the Clouds quite memorable. It's got Japp saying, well, Poirot, you can't even fly from Paris to London in a small aircraft without someone getting murdered en route, and Japp is absolutely right in that case. And you always found 1-2 Buckle My Shoe quite memorable, I think.
Certainly bits of it. When I was little, our mum was watching that one, and it must have been some sort of repeat in the middle of the day, and I remembered some children doing the rhyme 1-2 Buckle My Shoe and taking it all the way up to 1920 My Plate's Empty, which I've never forgotten because I never heard that anywhere else. So that's how I first recognised it on the DVD, and I was thinking, oh yes, the dentist's going to be murdered after he's seen Poirot, isn't he?
Series 5 then goes back to 50-minute short story episodes, and they run out of short stories after that, so they can't come back and make these regular 10, 50-minute episode series anymore. I always found the first episode of Series 5 very memorable, the adventure of the Egyptian tomb. I remember watching that when I was little, and I'd been studying and enjoying Egyptians at school, as I mentioned on the Tomorrow People podcast. That's why I like the Tomorrow People story of Ramesses' connection. You can find quite a lot of episodes where the doctor is the killer, or a doctor is the killer, or one of the killers. And even right back at the beginning of the case, when you made sure to try and make me remember that you were the psychiatrist from this court case, I thought, aha, now why does he want me to know that? Because I remember the clerk of the court read out his qualifications and experience, and before being a psychiatrist, his speciality was anesthesiology. You try to pull the cotton wool over the eyes of Poirot? No, monsieur, it cannot be done. That's something annoying they sometimes stick in, saying these English idioms slightly wrong for a joke. It's better if Hastings is there to gently correct him. If Miss Eliza Dunn will communicate with this address, she will hear something to her profit. Hastings goes, advantage. He trusts Hastings to correct him like that, and it works very well as part of their relationship.
Miss Lemon is taking down the letter, of course. That's the sort of thing she does.
She's absolutely indispensable for doing those secretarial duties and for looking things up, and she does an awfully good job, which not everybody can do, of pretending to look for something alphabetically. flicking through the right number of pages and coming to a believable place. And who's on the list of people who can fake look through alphabetical books successfully on the screen? Pauline Moran, Melissa Joan Hart as Sabrina the Teenage Witch, and not many others. I was actually quite disappointed watching the DVDs through that Miss Lemon didn't have more practical use. As a female operative, she could go into places and ask questions that the men wouldn't have such easy access to. And she actually does that once, quite successfully, where she pretends to be a reporter from The Ladies' Companion and goes to the nightclub to interview the woman who's on the run from the mafia and stuff. I'd like to have seen her used more like that. But of course, even sometimes when she doesn't seem to be involved very heavily in the episode, Poirot will say, aha, now we need some clarification on this, and he will ring up Miss Lemon in London, and she'll be straight down there on the train, or perhaps back on the phone, with all the information he needs that she's gone out and looked up, found from the records, or wheedled out of porters and archivists and so on, in double quick time, so Poirot can put the case together. So really, his gang, his three companions, are very important to his methods, to the show, to him as a character, to have someone to play off. And they all make an excellent contribution in their own way. We'll come back to that point very shortly. Yeah, by the end of series 5, kind of 1993 sort of time, they'd run out of short stories to adapt. So obviously, what were they going to do then? Come back and make feature-length episodes. And as we go through the show more and more, those feature-length episodes do get shorter and shorter as ITV want to put more and more adverts into their time slots. And ITV didn't seem to want to commit very strongly to doing these feature-length episodes regularly during the rest of the 90s. Poirot episodes after 1993 and before 2003 are quite sporadic. He tries to retire during that time, doesn't really manage, as I said. A couple of times we had, a special ITV presentation of Agatha Christie's Poirot this weekend. You haven't seen that for a few years, have you? And that was quite exciting to see. You get them sporadically in 94, 95, 96, and then I don't think there's a new one after that until early 2000. It's something ITV seem to be putting their hand in, putting their hand out, not too sure what to do with it. Really, a turning point for the show is the episodes that were produced in 2000. One of them aired in 2001, the other in 2002, kind of saving them up there. Evil Under the Sun and Murder in Mesopotamia. And these are the last two, until the very end, to feature those three regular supporting characters, Hastings, Jack, and Miss Lemon. They're all in Evil Under the Sun, which is very good in many ways, but it's annoying the way they get into it, with Poirot on a stupid diet and having to eat stupid lettuce and hating it and stuff. He's supposed to be there on holiday. It'd be even better if someone had hired him to investigate the case, but there we go. And Hastings is in Murder in Mesopotamia. And then in 2003, a real turning point came for the show, which allowed it to be made regularly once again and get finished off over the next 10 years, which is certainly a good thing. But a deliberate decision was made to change it a lot, to change the feel, the tone, the music. I was very disappointed not to hear the original Christopher Gunning music so much, or if they do include it at all, it's very mucked about with. But all that I could certainly forgive if they hadn't made the decision to deliberately cut out Hastings, Jack, and Miss Lemon. Now, you could say it kind of fits in with how things have been going. Hastings is married now. He wants to have a ranch in Argentina, and indeed, that's where we find him in the very final series in 2013. While Chief Inspector Japp, it seems, is moving up the ranks at Scotland Yard behind the scenes, and he's an assistant commissioner when we see him again in the final series 10 years later. But certainly these characters could, and in my opinion should, have been kept in the show, and it suffers a great deal without them. And Poirot as a character loses a great deal without them there to interact with him. As I say, that's the biggest problem I have with the 2003 onwards episodes. The good thing about the situation was that ITV did commit to not putting their hand in, putting their hand out, but to actually dedicatedly making Poirot on a regular basis, as well as Agatha Christie's Marple, a new adaptation of Miss Marple with Geraldine McEwen in the title role. Now, back when Poirot had first started, of course, Joan Hickson very famously was playing Miss Marple on the BBC. But by 2003, it was quite a reasonable time for a new Marple adaptation, and LWT no longer produced Agatha Christie. ITV Studios treated Poirot and Marple as basically one show in terms of budget and production, and they both had the same Agatha Christie logo, and then Poirot or Marple written underneath. So on the whole, I'm very glad that ITV committed to Agatha Christie at that point, and that it did mean that Poirot could get finished off over the next 10 years. But unfortunately, those 2003 onwards shows aren't as good as the earlier ones. The big reason, as I've just said, is making the very deliberate decision not to include those 3 regular supporting characters at all. But I do feel the darker tone, the attempts at being kind of sexier, edgier, don't really work. I notice in some of those early ITV Studios produced ones, it often starts with 2 characters in bed together. Not really necessary to get the point or the plot across. There's more swearing, light swearing. Obviously the budget isn't what it was. Sharing it with Marple perhaps mitigates it a bit. There's a lot of CG stuff going on. Of course, that's partly because of the time. They're very keen on doing things with their computers to save money and perhaps impress us. I mean, some of those train sequences, they're very obviously animated, look a lot less convincing than the opening of Thomas the Tank Engine. They have this establishing shot of outside Whitehaven Mansions where the car goes across. They recolour the car in several shots. They relight it. There's a lot of budget-saving computer work going on there. I do find that kind of thing a bit distracting. Early on, you get a lot of lovely location filming at country stations and preserved railways and things, really evoking the 1930s setting. It seems very real, whereas in those early 21st century ones, you've got a shot of one platform at Peterborough railway station and some 1930s background has been painted in. It's not so convincing, it's not so nice. But as I say, given that that was what they needed to do to keep making Poirot, commit to it with ITV Studios, share the time and the budget with Geraldine McEwen as Marple. I don't want to complain too much about it because I was and am very pleased that they did commit to it and get it finished off.
In both eras, some episodes are better than others depending on the writer. With LWT, the early stuff, you really want Clive Exton, who's the showrunner, chief writer, writes up the mysteries well and puts in those personal touches, overwrites the pilot, yes, but then realises he can leave a lot of that stuff in the hands of the actors. You get Anthony Horowitz, possibly underwriting a little bit. We have discussed Anthony Horowitz's writing of Poirot and coming up with Crime Traveller and doing the Alex Rider series of young adult novels and say, well, he will fulfill a brief efficiently, well enough. And then you get David Renwick, or is it pronounced Rennick, the Jonathan Creek guy, trying to be funny and put in all these jokes and misunderstandings about Hastings going along and seeing a guy who's expecting another guy called Brighton, or someone coming along with a parrot and saying, I've got a parrot for you, Mr. Poirot. Oh, sorry, I've got a Poirot for you, Mr. Poirot, which is pathetic.
Of course, as usual in these things, the best way to get humour is to leave it to the cast. And those regular actors do produce a lot of smile-worthy, if not laugh-worthy moments between them. Like when Poirot turns up at Japp's house, and Japp is surprised and pleased to see him. You enjoyed his delivery of, you better come in and have a cup of tea. And even in these 21st century episodes, Poirot on his own can be amusing. David Suchet adds a lot of humour to the bit with the fish paste sandwiches, which you've always found quite quite memorable, where he's setting out a little scenario to prove that nobody can possibly have told the difference between the sandwiches and therefore poisoned them. He comes out with, "Our killer approaches the sandwiches," with such a twinkle in his eye and a funny sort of movement recreating the supposed crime. That's definitely always worth a smile from me.
Five Little Pigs is the first one by ITV Studios, and that's actually the one that got me interested in it. And it is an interesting retrospective kind of cold case, and it's well written, so I like that one.
I do like the way in Five Little Pigs he does piece together the past based on the testimony of these five people. And again, like with Mademoiselle Nick's letter, he spots something that doesn't quite add up and fits together the truth from there. Why is Amyas Creole going to see to his young sister-in-law's packing for school? Why is the man going to do that, go through the petticoats or the underwear, when we have the sister, the governess, the housekeeper who might do it? And from there he unravels the whole mystery.
But what do I remember for being particularly bad? A few of them. Murder on the Orient Express. I don't really remember the way that the dialogue is written or the story is put together, but I do remember they place a huge emphasis on this unprecedented religiousness of Poirot, and he gets into a rather self-righteous speech about meting out your own justice and it being for God to judge.
It's completely overstated, it's true. You can see at times his Catholic religion is important to him and a big part of his life, but to use it in that way, to make him all sanctimonious, is really overstated and really bad for the character and makes him come across as kind of holier than thou.
There's the clocks, which I find very interesting because it should be a good mystery and intriguing story, but the way that it's written was quite fashionable at the time. The writer is trying to be clever and make the dialogue sound interesting and colourful, and it only ends up sounding unnatural. And that really ruins the episode for me, and is a terrible waste of Tom Burke. And Phil Daniels, who gets told it's not important who he is, but who he is.
As Jap isn't around, you get a lot of guest policemen in those ITV Studios episodes. Phil Daniels there in the clocks, as you mentioned. You get one of them who turns up twice, Superintendent Spence. But normally, you'll get just a random guest investigating police officer who'll go, "Oh, Monsieur Poirot, what are you doing here? Oh, Monsieur Poirot, I've pulled apart this case. I think you're barking up the wrong tree, and it's proved to be wrong." There was definitely still a place for Jap in the show, wasn't there? And I do always find in those early ITV Studio episodes, Poirot does feel somewhat adrift without his regular cast to talk to, interact with. And I think perhaps the powers that be did realise this as well, because they quite quickly brought in the two regular supporting characters, or semi-regular. They make one or two appearances each in a group of 4 episodes, one of whom I mentioned earlier, Zoe Wanamaker as Ariadne Oliver, the other one being Georges, who was played by an actor called David Yelland, and he's Poirot's manservant, mon valet, as Poirot will often refer to him. I don't think Georges adds nearly as much to the show as Ariadne Oliver does, but it is good to have the pair of them around as regular people in Poirot's life. And they do both appear in some of the later Poirot books, so there's certainly a precedent to involve them in the show. But it's not like Hastings, Jap and Miss Lemon don't appear in some of those books. So simply to say Jap, Hastings and Miss Lemon aren't in all of them anyway doesn't really deal with the fact that they were cut out of the show very deliberately. But of course, inevitably, all 3 of them do come back in the final series, the final group of 5 specials. It had always been made in groups of 4 specials by ITV Studios before that, and it was every couple of years, and they'd spread out the airings over a couple of years, so they didn't actually have to organise getting together to make it too often. But thank goodness somebody realised, well, we've at least got to have Hastings back for Curtain, Poirot's final case, and I was glad to read in 2013 Miss Lemon and Chief Inspector Jap, or as he is then, as I mentioned, Assistant Commissioner Jap, are back for one of the episodes in that final series, The Big Four, which is actually one of the worst written, worst pulled off episodes of all. But it is nice to see all the regular cast back together. David Suchet made it known in an interview that filming Curtain was always going to be a difficult experience for him after 25 years, and actually it was the first one of the final 5, the last batch of 5, filmed, so that his last time playing Poirot wasn't Poirot's final case. And the last one they filmed was Dead Man's Folly, which is quite a good one, and has Tom Ellis as the guest police officer. And indeed it would be impossible to think of all the interesting guest stars that appeared in Poirot over 25 years. We've mentioned a few of them here as they've come up. But really, it's more unusual to find a feature-length Poirot that doesn't have at least one interesting guest star that we've got elsewhere in our DVD collection, and or we know quite well from somewhere else. So there we are. Poirot was an ITV staple for a long time, and David Suchet's immersive performance as Hercule Poirot truly is a TV performance for the ages. Join us again on the final Sunday in August for our last regular podcast before we move on to a series of specials. Our 80th and final regular episode will be about
the 1990 film Ghost.
So until then, good night out there.
Whatever you are.